It began as a performance, one that England repeated for centuries, each time with the same dreadful rhythm: the slow march to the scaffold, the crowd pressing in, the executioner waiting with practiced indifference. These were not random killings. They were spectacles of power, messages carved into flesh, to remind everyone who truly ruled. To be convicted of high treason in England was not simply to die. It was to be publicly unmade, to have one's body transformed into a warning that lingered long after the screams had faded. What made these executions so chilling wasn't just their brutality, but their ritual precision. Every detail, from the route of the prisoner's cart to the placement of his severed head, carried meaning. It was punishment elevated to ceremony, terror disguised as justice. When we think of the phrase high treason, we might imagine secret plots, whispered betrayals, or failed rebellions. But in medieval and early modern England, treason was an elastic term, broad enough to ensnare almost anyone the crown feared. The 1352 Treason Act, passed under Edward III, defined it as an offense against the king's person, his family, or his authority. To compass or imagine the death of the king, even to speak of it in anger, could lead to the most horrific end imaginable. And yet, this was not just law. It was a theater. By the Tudor era, treason executions had evolved into state-orchestrated dramas. When Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, dozens of monks, nobles, and even close friends were dragged into this machinery of terror. Their executions were staged like civic festivals. People were told they were witnessing justice, but what they were really watching was the monarchy asserting its divine right to control life and death. The journey from condemned cell to execution site followed a choreography that left no room for mercy. At Tyburn, the most infamous of all execution grounds, prisoners were strapped to hurdles, wooden frames dragged by horses and hauled through the muddy streets of London. The idea was deliberate humiliation, traitors' bodies scraping over the ground, exposed to jeers and missiles from the crowd. And then came the ritual itself. The most feared punishment in English history: hanging, drawing, and quartering. It began with hanging, but only almost to the point of death. The victim was cut down before dying, gasping and conscious as the executioner's knife opened his abdomen. The entrails were pulled out, sometimes burned before his eyes, while priests urged him to confess. His heart, the symbol of loyalty, was ripped from his chest and held aloft. "Behold the heart of a traitor!" the executioner cried. Finally, the body was hacked into 4 quarters and the head severed. These pieces were then parboiled in salt to delay decay and displayed on city gates or bridges, a final warning to any who might defy the crown. This ritual was not confined to men. Women convicted of treason faced their own grim fate. They were burned alive at the stake. Burning was considered more modest, as it preserved the woman's body from public dismemberment. It's almost unbearable to imagine that this was seen as mercy. Take, for instance, Sir Thomas More, executed in 1535 for refusing to recognize Henry VIII's supremacy over the church. More's death, quiet, dignified, resolute, became one of the most famous in English history. On the scaffold, he declared himself the king's good servant, but God's first. The executioner begged his forgiveness before striking. Yet the symbolism was clear. Not even conscience could defy the king. A few decades later, Guy Fawkes met his end for the infamous gunpowder plot of 1605. His story has been mythologized, but his death was brutally real. Hauled to Old Palace Yard, Fawkes was forced to witness the execution of his co-conspirators before it was his turn. Knowing what awaited him, he leapt from the gallows, breaking his neck to spare himself the agony of disembowelment. Still, his body was mutilated and quartered afterward. Pieces of him were sent to the 4 corners of the realm, and yet the crowd came every time. Ordinary people, even children, watched. They treated it like a grim carnival, buying food, gossiping, and waiting for the fatal moment. The line between justice and entertainment blurred. The monarchy understood this well. Fear worked best when it felt familiar. By the 17th century, these executions had grown even more ritualized, especially after the English Civil War. When King Charles I was executed in 1649, it marked a stunning reversal. For the first time, it was the monarch's own body that became the warning. On that January day, outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, over 50,000 people gathered in near silence. As the axe fell, a groan went up, part part grief, part awe. For a moment, the entire idea of divine kingship seemed to collapse. Yet when the monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles's execution was reframed as sacrilege. The punishment of traitors resumed with new fury. The message was simple. The crown could be challenged, but the price would always be flesh and blood. Consider William Wallace in the 14th century. Yes, centuries earlier, but his punishment became the model for what followed. His quartered body was distributed to Edinburgh, Perth, Aberdeen, and Newcastle, a map of terror that crossed borders. Later, traitors like the Jacobites in 1746 suffered the same fate. At Carlisle and Edinburgh, rebels were publicly butchered, their heads nailed to spikes, their remains rotting in the open air. But what made these rituals endure so long? Why did a supposedly Christian kingdom cling to such barbarity? The answer lies in the fusion of faith, law, and fear. Treason was seen not just as a crime against the king, but against God's order itself. To destroy the traitor's body was to cleanse the realm of spiritual infection. Even the language of sentencing reflected this twisted theology. Judges declared that the condemned should be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck, cut down alive, his entrails taken out and burned before him, his head cut off, and his body divided into 4 parts, to be disposed of at his majesty's pleasure. Every phrase was coldly formal, the liturgy of terror. By the 18th century, however, public opinion began to shift. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about dignity and punishment. Crowds grew restless, not with pity, but discomfort. They no longer wanted to see men torn apart in the name of justice. The last full sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was carried out in 1782 on a man named David Tyree for espionage, not rebellion. The horror was so great that newspapers described it with disgust rather than triumph. By 1814, the punishment was officially abolished, but by then, it had already burned itself into England's collective memory. What remains most haunting is how long this ritual lasted, how ordinary it once seemed. For centuries, English justice was not content to kill. It had to display its victims. Power had to be seen, smelled, and remembered. When we walk across London Bridge today, there's no trace of the rotting heads that once adorned its gatehouses. But for hundreds of years, travelers saw them there, blackened, tarred, grinning skulls swinging in the wind. Each one is a silent sermon about loyalty, fear, and obedience. And perhaps that's the real legacy of these executions. They weren't just acts of cruelty, they were instruments of control, carefully engineered to shape belief. So next time you read about treason in an old English chronicle, remember what it once meant. It wasn't only a betrayal of a crown, it was an invitation to become part of a ritual, one that turned human bodies into symbols of power and justice into spectacle. In the end, the monarchy survived, but the spectacle faded. Today, it's history that preserves the memory of those gruesome rituals, reminders that behind every ceremony of justice lies a shadow of terror,